Maude for Maude's Book Club. Let's read more books is our slogan here. Naomi Novik, how are you? Thank you so
Oh,
much
no.
for joining me on the show.
Hello, Maude. It's lovely to be here.
I'm so excited to be talking books with you, mainly because I've read a bunch of them and your name keeps popping up from other fantasy authors. And I think that's one of the highest compliments when authors, talking about their own books, they're like, sure. Yeah, I've done a bunch. Yeah. And then their face lights up where I'm like, who are you loving at the moment? And it's like, oh, you've got to get a load of all of these amazing authors. And the fact that people like Seanan McGuire and Patrick Rothfuss are singing your praises so much, I'm just like, right, let's get Naomi on this show. So I'm so grateful that you're joining me today to talk about our February's pick right here, Spinning Silver. This is a reimagining of a fairy tale, Rumpelstiltskin, but you totally flipped it on its head and you have kind of given the middle finger to what fairy tales were about in a Disney-esque era, which was girls should be lovely, girls should watch their P's and Q's, girls need to be rescued, and they absolutely shouldn't talk out of line. I just love the fact that we have refreshing female characters who don't need rescuing, who are so kick-ass, who are just wonderful. So I kind of want to talk about a bunch of questions with Spinning Silver. We've got a lot of your fans in the audience as well at the moment. I'm talking so much here.
Great.
This is your second book that you decided to reimagine as a fairy tale. Why the transition from dragons and your Temeraire series, which I'd love to get stuck into as well, into sort of deconstructing and reimagining fairy tales?
For me, honestly, it's interesting because other people and I can see why, right? Look at my work and say, well, it's all so different. In general, for me, the thing about all my work, which I feel is actually relatively consistent, is that I like to be in conversation. And so for me, the Temeraire series is a conversation with the Napoleonic Wars. It's a conversation with the Patrick O'Brian books. It's a conversation with the Pern books by Anne McCaffrey, which, I grew up reading. And it's sort of, well, what if things were sort of turned on their side? What if I mashed these two things together, then ask myself the questions, all right, well, what would happen? How is the world different if suddenly there are dragons in the Napoleonic Wars? And for me, that's what Spinning Silver and Uprooted both were a little bit similarly. Like I was having that question of what if put my finger to the fairy tale and start yanking it around and mashing it up. And for me, with Uprooted, what was interesting that I didn't set out to do it deliberately, but in retrospect, it feels quite natural. But I started writing Uprooted shortly after my daughter was born. I found both Uprooted and Spinning Silver for me are actually, in a way, the story of my family. That's not something that is apparent to anyone else from the outside, but that's what those two books were for me. So for me, it was quite a natural evolution, even though obviously from a reader's point of view, that isn't obvious on the surface at all, right?
We actually have a question from Avery. A lot of European fairy tales are actually deeply anti-Semitic. What is it about Rumpelstiltskin in particular that made you want to reclaim it?
So it was a little bit fortuitous. Because of I got invited to this anthology called The Scarlet, which was a wonderful anthology. I highly recommend it. All the stories in there are just fantastic. The way that the anthology worked was the editors asked us to each choose a different fairy tale to reimagine. And I procrastinated. And the list got shorter and shorter and shorter. And they were saying, so have you chosen your fairy tale yet? The deadline's pretty soon. And I finally was all right, I have to make my choice. And I looked and it was a relatively short list, which I like. And Rumpelstiltskin was on there. And the thing about it that sort of was evocative for me is that my paternal grandmother, was at one point arrested on the other side of the Iron Curtain for smuggling dollars for gold. Because in the Soviet Union, obviously, on the Iron Curtain, the currency was controlled. And they would just print more money when they needed to.
Right.
Which meant that nobody wanted to keep their money in rubles or in zloty. They wanted dollars because dollars were safe. And so people would send their gold out of the country and get dollars back. And this was extremely illegal. As a child, my family, both sides of my family, endured enormous kinds of trauma during the war, during World War II, and afterwards during the communist era. But the way that those stories came to me when I was young was as humorous. My dad, especially, my father would tell stories that, in retrospect, as an adult, while I was writing Spinning Silver and recalling these stories, I was like, what? No, this is horrible.
Yeah.
But as a child, he told them, children pick up tone. And I think that's, in a way, how he's dealing with his own trauma, right? He was investing these stories, but he was telling us these stories, but making them not traumatic for us by making them sound exciting or funny. And so this was a grandmother's adventure that she had gotten. And obviously, by the time he was telling us the story, it had all worked out and she was safe in the United States. What came to me as a child and what stuck in my head was the idea of my grandmother as sort of this romantic smuggler of gold. And
I love that.
obviously in Rumpelstiltskin, right, you have the spinning straw into gold and the miller's daughter's hair of gold. And obviously how that the blondness, right, is sort of invested with this wonderfulness, with magic, where you have Rumpelstiltskin in this sort of anti-Semitic caricature. But obviously for me, that sort of flash of the gold and thinking about the anti-Semitic quality of it, I really kind of wanted to lean into it and sort of talk about, because many of the experiences my father's family had was due to anti-Semitism. And that was a lot of his trauma from Eastern Europe. And so because of that, I sort of ended up picking Rumpelstiltskin. And the idea for me from the very beginning of Spinning Silver is that Rumpelstiltskin is a story that exists. That fairy tale is told in Miriam's world. She has been told that fairy tale, but she reads it as a deliberate hostile attack on her and her family. And I thought that was an interesting place to begin from in telling the story and in telling the story and sort of pulling it apart and taking elements up as well.
Oh, I love that whole fantastic story about the history on it. And I love the fact that your father's told it in a way for 5-year-old ears, where you're like, wow, this is fantastic. And this is the message that I'm getting. And when you peel back those layers, you're just like, oh, this is actually so much raw and more real and more vulnerable and more catastrophic as well.